Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening a file that feels less like a geopolitical history and more like a high-stakes Shakespearean tragedy.
It really has all the elements, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's got everything you'd expect from a prestige drama. A spare heir who wasn't supposed to rule, a bitter brotherly feud that almost caused a civil war.
A modernization drive that dragged a society kicking and screaming into the 20th century.
And an assassination that, in hindsight, feels disturbingly inevitable.
It really is one of the most dramatic arcs in modern history. We are talking about a figure who quite literally stopped the industrialized world in its tracks and forced the global superpowers to blink.
We're talking about King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And to understand the sheer magnitude of this man's life, I want to start with a single moment that I guarantee listeners, or certainly their parents, remember vividly. We have to start in October 1973.
The oil crisis. Yeah, the moment the world changed.
Right. If you were driving a car in the US, the UK, Canada, or Japan during that time, your life suddenly ground to a halt. I mean, we're not just talking about higher prices.
No, this is different.
We're talking about gas lines stretching for blocks, people abandoning their cars on the side of the highway because they ran dry, waiting in line.
Panic at the pumps.
Exactly. Panic at the pumps. Even daylight savings time was extended in the U.S. just to save electricity. It was a complete societal shock.
It was a complete psychological shock. You have to remember, prior to October 1973, the West operated on the assumption of cheap, infinite energy.
Of course.
It was the foundation of the entire post-war economic boom. Then, overnight, the price of oil jumps nearly 300%.
300%.
It went from $3 a barrel to nearly $12.
Which, admittedly, sounds like a bargain today. I mean, I wish they could pay $12 a barrel. But in 1973 dollars, that was an economic heart attack.
It was, and for the first time, the West realized that its massive industrial engine ran on fuel controlled by people who might not always agree with them.
And this wasn't an accident, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't a hurricane or a supply chain glitch.
No, this was a calculated political weapon wielded by one man, King Faisal.
He targeted the industrialized world specifically because of their support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And the result wasn't just economic pain. It was a total tectonic shift in global power. Time magazine named him Man of the Year in 1974. He effectively forced the world to acknowledge Saudi Arabia not just as a gas station, but as a superpower.
He did. But here is the mission for today's deep dive. If you only know Faisal for the oil embargo, you are missing 90% of the story.
Oh, easily.
The man himself was a massive contradiction. He was a modernization reformist who introduced television and world's education to a deeply, deeply conservative society.
But at the same time, he was this incredibly pious, ascetic figure who was militantly anti-communist and anti-Zionist.
A total paradox. And our goal today is to unpack how this spare heir, the third son, never really meant to be King Rose to power through a family coup, modernized his country against, violent internal resistance, and then was killed in a way that is... The irony of his death is just haunting.
It really is. We have a massive stack of sources today. Historical records, biographical details, military accounts. So let's go back to the beginning. Where does the story of Faisal actually start?
It starts in Riyadh, 1906. Now, you have to picture Riyadh in 1906. This isn't the city of glass skyscrapers we see today. Not even close.
Right, this is the middle of the desert.
It was a mud brick fortress town, completely isolated from the outside world. Faisal was the third son of King Abdulaziz, the legendary founder of modern Saudi Arabia. But right from birth, there is a detail that sets Faisal apart from his brothers.
Okay, what was that?
It's his mother, Tarfa. She wasn't just from any prominent tribe. She was from the Al-Sheikh family.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't experts in Saudi genealogy, let's unpack that. Why is the Al-Sheikh family so significant?
It's absolutely crucial. The Al-Sheikh are the direct descendants of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab,
the founder of the strict interpretation of Islam dominant in Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. The entire Saudi state is built on this pact, right? It dates back to the 1700s between the political leadership, the Al-Saud, and the religious leadership, the Al-Sheikh.
So by having a mother from the religious nobility and a father from the political royalty, Faisal he's physically the bridge between these two pillars of power.
Precisely. And this wasn't just symbolic. His mother died when he was just a baby, so he was actually raised by his maternal grandparents. He grew up in a very strict, intensely religious household.
I read he had memorized the entire Quran by age 9.
Age 9. And he was studying Sharia law. This background explains so much about his later life.
Right, because when he eventually pushed for controversial reforms like TV or girls' education, he had this built-in armor. The religious scholars, the ulema, they couldn't just dismiss him as some westernized secularist.
They couldn't. They knew he was one of them. That credibility was his single most valuable political asset. He spoke their language probably better than they did.
But he wasn't just a religious scholar. King Abdulaziz saw something sharp in him very early on.
He did. There's this incredible story from 1919. Faisal is just 13 years old.
13. I mean, at 13, I think I was struggling to organize a group project in middle school.
Well, at 13, Faisal is sent on a high-stakes diplomatic mission to London. He becomes the first ever Saudi royal to visit England.
Why on earth would you send a 13-year-old to negotiate with the British Empire?
Yeah.
That seems like a massive gamble.
It was tragic circumstances, actually. His older brother, Turkey, was supposed to go. He was the heir apparent's brother and a real rising star, but he died during the Spanish flu pandemic that swept the world.
Wow.
So Abdulaziz looks at his sons and picks Faisal, the spare.
Imagine the culture shock. He's coming from the deserts of Nejd, which, as you said, was completely isolated, no electricity, no cars to speak of, and he lands in post-World War I London.
It had to be jarring. There are photos of this tour. You see this young teenager looking so serious and dignified in his traditional robes, headdress, and dagger, surrounded by all these European dignitaries in top hats and tails.
Who did he even meet?
He met Lord Curzon, the Foreign Secretary. He went to the House of Lords. Then he went on to France and toured the battlefields of World War I.
That has to shape your worldview. Seeing the sheer industrial scale of the West, the weaponry, the organization, but also the devastation.
It absolutely did. He saw the power of modernization up close, but interestingly, he wasn't intimidated by it. He didn't come back wanting to be British. He came back wanting to make Saudi Arabia powerful enough to stand on its own. He realized that to survive, his country needed the tools of the West, but to keep the soul of the East.
And his father clearly recognized that potential. There's that famous quote King Abdulaziz used to say about him.
I really wish I had 3 Faisals.
That is some high praise. But also a bit of a dig at the other sons, isn't it?
A little bit, yes. But Abdulaziz backed it up with real responsibility. He gave Faisal military command very, very early. In 1922, Faisal led 6,000 fighters to take control of the Azir region in the south.
At 16 years old.
16. Later, he commanded the entire campaign in the Saudi-Yemeni War in 1934.
So he's a diplomat and a general before he's even 30.
And a viceroy. He was appointed viceroy of Hijaz in 1926, which is the western part of the country containing Mecca and Jeddah. Then, and this is key, he became foreign minister in 1930.
And he basically held that job for the rest of his life.
Virtually continuously, with only one brief break. For decades, he was the face of Saudi Arabia to the world. He met FDR on the USS Quincy in 1943. He helped found the UN in San Francisco in 1945.
But despite that incredible resume, general, diplomat, viceroy, foreign minister, when his father died in 1953, Faisal didn't become king.
No. The succession laws or traditions really favored the eldest son, so his older half-brother, Saud, became king. Faisal became crown prince and prime minister.
And this sets the stage for what I think is the most tense period in Saudi domestic history. The feud between King Saud and Crown Prince Faisal. This wasn't just a disagreement over dinner.
No.
This was a struggle for the soul of the country.
It was existential. And you have to understand the context of the 1950s in the Middle East. The region was on fire.
Monarchy was going out of style.
Very much so. You have Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who had overthrown the king there, and he was preaching this secular pan-Arabism. He was actively calling for the overthrow of reactionary regimes like Saudi Arabia.
So you have this massive external threat, and how is King Saud handling it?
Poorly. To put it mildly, Saud was seen as, well, let's say, diplomatically challenged compared to Faisal. But the bigger problem was his spending. It was out of control.
The famous palaces.
Massive royal palaces, luxury cars, just handing out cash to tribes to buy their loyalty, all while the country was financially unstable, bordering on bankruptcy.
So the treasury is empty, and there is a revolutionary wave next door just waiting to sweep them away. The family must have been panicking.
They were. By 1958, the pressure was too much. The senior princes and the ulema stepped in. They essentially forced King Saud to hand over all executive powers to Faisal to save the economy. It was a soft coup.
Here, Faisal, you fix the mess, but let your brother keep the crown and the title.
Exactly. And Faisal went to work. He slashed the budget, he stabilized the currency, he started getting things in order. But Saud did not take this lying down. He resented being a figurehead.
So he starts pushing back.
He starts rallying tribes, using his own money to build support. And in 1960, Faisal actually resigned in protest because Saud kept obstructing his reforms.
He just walked away.
He did. He went to his retreat in Taif and said, fine, you run it. But of course, the situation just got worse without him. By 1962, the family was begging him to come back as prime minister.
And that leads us to 1964, the climax of this feud. This part of the story, it really plays out like an action movie.
It does. Faisal had had enough. He started consolidating power for real this time. He removed Saud's loyalists from key military posts, and crucially, he put his half-brother, Prince Abdullah, who would later become king himself, in charge of the National Guard.
And King Saud threatens to use his own force, the Royal Guard, to take power back.
It was a standoff, a terrifying standoff. Faisal ordered the National Guard to surround Saud's palace. So you literally had two military forces loyal to two different brothers facing off in the streets of Riyadh.
It was moments away from a civil war.
Absolutely. One wrong move and the whole thing could have turned into a bloodbath.
So how do they stop it? What de-escalated the situation?
The religious scholars, the Grand Mufti, remember, Faisal's cousin from the Al-Ash Sheikh family intervened. The ulema got together and issued a fatwa.
A religious ruling.
Yes, declaring Saud unfit to rule due to his health and his ineptitude.
And Faisal's reaction to this is really interesting. The sources say he was reluctant to take the throne.
He was. He had sworn an oath to his father to support Saud. He really struggled with the decision. But ultimately, the consensus of the family and the ulema was that Saud had to go for the kingdom to survive. So in November 1964, Saud abdicated and went into exile. Faisal became king.
And his first speech really sets the tone for his entire reign. He said, "I beg of you, brothers, to look upon me as both brother and servant. Majesty is reserved to God alone."
That humility was genuine, but it was also incredibly savvy politics. He was signaling that he wasn't going to be the lavish, distant monarch his brother was. He was a servant of the state and of the faith.
So Faisal is now in charge. He's got the throne. And he immediately shifts gears into what I'd call hyper-modernization.
Yeah.
He had actually laid the groundwork for this even before he became king. Right?
That's right. In 1962, while he was essentially running the show as prime minister, he issued something called the 10-point program. It was a roadmap for building a modern state.
And the biggest item on that list, which I think often gets overlooked, is the abolition of slavery.
Wait, 1962? Slavery was legal in Saudi Arabia until 1962. It was. It was deeply entrenched in the social structure. Now, it wasn't the industrial chattel slavery of the American South, but it was slavery.
That is startlingly recent.
It is. But Faisal knew it had to end. There was external pressure. Sure, JFK and the U.S. were pushing for it, but Faisal was the one who had to execute it domestically. And he did it in a very pragmatic way.
Right? He didn't just sign a piece of paper. He put money behind it.
Yes. The government paid compensation for every enslaved person freed. About $2,000 per person. Around 1,682 people were freed officially. It was a massive social shift, and he pushed it through despite very strong conservative resistance from the tribes who viewed owning slaves as a status symbol.
And that was just the start. Once the oil revenue really started flowing, especially after he renegotiated the agreements with Aramco to get a fairer share, he just poured that money into infrastructure.
The 5-year plan started in 1970. We're talking roads, ports, airports, but the most critical thing you can build in a desert.
Water.
Water. The Jizan Dam.
Completed in 1970.
Exactly. Dams in Abha, Wadi Hanifa. He established the Agricultural Bank to give interest-free loans to farmers. He understood that food and water security were national security. It was foundational.
But the reform that probably caused the most friction, the most pushback, was education. Specifically, women's education.
This is where we have to mention Queen Ifat.
Yes, let's talk about her. She wasn't a typical Saudi royal wife from a local tribe.
No, not at all. She was born and raised in Turkey. She was highly educated. Faisal met her in Istanbul on a diplomatic visit. She was the driving force behind a lot of these social reforms.
So it was a partnership.
Very much so. Together, they started Dar al-Hanan in 1956, which was the first proper girls' school. Then in 1960, they established the General Presidency for Girls' Education.
I can only imagine this did not go over well with the hardliners.
It absolutely did not. There were protests. Fathers refused to send their daughters. But here is where Faisal's unique background, remember that religious upbringing came in handy.
He could debate them on their own terms.
Exactly. He didn't say, we're doing this to be like the West. He said, we are doing this because Islam requires all Muslims, men and women, to seek knowledge. He used their own logic to persuade them. It was a master class in political maneuvering.
But there was one innovation that he couldn't just debate his way through. One piece of technology that became a flashpoint.
Television.
Television.
Yes. In 1965, Faisal introduced national TV broadcasts. The religious zealots were furious. They believed that images of humans were forbidden, a form of idolatry.
And this leads to a specific and very tragic incident that, in hindsight, is just haunting.
It is. A group of protesters decided to attack the new TV station headquarters in Riyadh, and leading the attack was a Prince Khalid bin Musaid.
Faisal's own nephew.
His nephew led the attack. And in the chaos, as they tried to storm the building, the police shot and killed Prince Khalid.
Wow. So the king introduces TV, his nephew attacks the station, and the police kill the nephew.
Faisal was reportedly devastated, but he stood by the decision to have the station. He believed the country couldn't remain in the Dark Ages, cut off from the world. But that death planted a seed of vengeance that would sit dormant for 10 years.
And we'll definitely put a pin in that, because that is going to come back in a big way. But first, we have to look at the global stage. We mentioned the oil embargo at the top, but Faisal's foreign policy was about so much more than just oil.
It was an ideological war. In one corner, you had Nasser in Egypt, promoting pan-Arabism, secular, socialist, leaning towards the Soviet Union. And in the other corner, you had Faisal promoting pan-Islamism.
What was the core difference there?
Pan-Arabism was about uniting people based on Arab ethnicity and language. Pan-Islamism was about uniting people based on a shared Islamic faith. Faisal founded institutions like the Muslim World League to push this idea and counter Nasser's influence.
And Faisal was strictly anti-communist.
Militantly so. He refused to have any diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union. He saw communism as godless and fundamentally incompatible with Islam. In his mind, he often lumped communism and Zionism together as two sides of the same coin foreign, aggressive ideologies invading the region.
This rivalry with Nasser played out in a literal war, didn't it? The Yemen Civil War.
It was a classic proxy war. In the 1960s, a coup in Yemen overthrew the king there. Egypt sent tens of thousands of troops to support the new Republicans. Saudi Arabia sent money and weapons to support the royalists who were fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains. It dragged on for years.
But then 1967 happens, the Six-Day War, and everything changes.
The Six-Day War changed everything. Israel defeated the combined Arab armies, Egypt, Syria, Jordan in less than a week. Nasser was utterly humiliated, his military was destroyed, and the Egyptian economy was in ruins.
And this is where Faisal makes a really surprising move. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't kick Nasser while he's down.
Not at all. He rescues him. At a summit in Khartoum after the war, Faisal pledged huge subsidies. I think it was around $154 million annually to Egypt to help them rebuild.
That's a fortune at the time.
It was. And there's this famous moment where he and Nasser, these bitter rivals, embraced at the airport and called each other brother.
It's the keep your enemies closer strategy, or maybe just a pragmatic realization that a collapsed Egypt was bad for everyone in the region.
It was pure pragmatism. And after Nasser died and Anwar Sadat took over, Faisal found a partner he could really work with. Sadat was moving away from the Soviets and wanted to get closer to the U.S. They formed a very close alliance.
Which brings us full circle to 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attack Israel to regain their lost territory. The U.S. steps in with a massive airlift to resupply Israel, and Faisal finally plays his trump card.
The oil embargo.
Yeah.
We have to understand, Faisal had warned the U.S. about this. He had told them for years, he told Henry Kissinger directly, that their unconditional support for Israel would have consequences.
And they just didn't believe him.
They didn't believe him. They thought, well, Saudi Arabia needs us to buy their oil more than we need to buy it. They severely underestimated him.
And when he cut production and banned exports to the U.S. and other Western countries, the market panic was instant.
It wasn't just about the price, it was the psychological shock. The realization that the West's entire industrial engine ran on fuel they did not control.
This was the moment Saudi Arabia truly realized its leverage.
Yes. It funded the massive development boom in the kingdom that followed. But you're right, it also put a target on Faisal's back. There were plenty of conspiracy theories that Western powers wanted him gone after that.
Right, because when you disrupt the global economy that severely, you make some very powerful enemies. But before we get to the end of his life, I want to touch on who he was personally. We've talked about him being pious and ascetic, but What was he like day to day?
By all accounts, he was a man of integrity and extreme humility. He hated pomp and ceremony. He was tall, gaunt, usually just wore a simple Bedouin thobe, even when meeting foreign dignitaries.
What did he do for fun? Did he have any hobbies?
His main passions were falconry and hunting, very traditional Bedouin pursuits. He also loved reading, especially poetry.
And his family life was interesting, too. He had multiple wives, which was standard for the time. But we mentioned Queen Ifet earlier. Their children weren't just sitting around in palaces.
No, and this is a key part of his legacy. He insisted his children be highly educated. He sent his sons to the best universities on the West Princeton, Georgetown, Sandhurst, the RAF College at Cranwell.
Give us some examples.
Well, Prince Saud al-Faisal, who graduated from Princeton, went on to become the foreign minister for 40 years. Prince Turki al-Faisal, a Georgetown grad, became the intelligence chief and later ambassador to the U.S. and the U.K.
His daughter, Princess Sarah, was a huge activist for women's welfare.
That's right. So he was building a meritocratic generation within the royal family. He wanted them to be competent, not just titled.
That's a huge shift.
It was. He spoke English and French fluently himself, though he usually insisted on speaking Arabic in formal meetings. There are stories of him listening to his translators and then correcting them when they got the nuance wrong. He was sharp as a tack.
Which makes the end of his life all the more tragic. He wasn't senile. He wasn't losing his grip on power. He was at the absolute height of his power and influence.
He was Time's Man of the Year. He was arguably the leader of the Islamic world.
March 25, 1975. Take us to that day.
It was a Tuesday morning. The king was holding a majlis in Riyadh. This is a traditional open audience where citizens and officials can come to petition the king directly.
So it's an open room, people coming and going, not a high-security situation.
Exactly. The king was receiving a delegation from Kuwait. And in the waiting room, there was a young prince, his nephew, Faisal bin Musaid.
This is the nephew, the brother of the prince who was killed at the TV station 10 years earlier.
The very same. He had just returned from the United States. He wasn't seen as a threat. He was family. He was just another person in line.
So the door's open.
The prince walks up to the king. The king recognizes him. He leans his head forward to kiss his nephew on the cheek, a traditional Saudi greeting.
And then?
And then the prince pulls out a pistol from his robes. He shoots the king 3 times at point-blank range. 1 shot hits the chin. 1 goes through the ear.
Oh, my God. Just absolute chaos.
Bedlam. A bodyguard strikes the prince with a sheathed sword. The oil minister, Zaki Yamani, who was standing right there, screams at the guards, "Don't kill him! Don't kill him!"
Why? I mean, in that moment, why did he want him alive?
He needed to know why. Was this a coup? Was it a foreign plot? Was it the CIA, the Mossad, the communists? They had to question him. The fate of the country could have been hanging in the balance.
So what was the official finding?
Well, initially, there were claims he was insane, he'd had some issues in the U.S., but the medical experts, a panel of doctors, ruled that he was perfectly sane when he committed the act. He was tried and convicted of regicide.
And the motive?
It almost certainly goes back to 1965. Vengeance for his brother, Khalid, who was killed attacking the TV station.
That is, the irony is just suffocating. The very technology Faisal introduced to modernize the country television led to the riots, which led to the brother's death, which, 10 years later, led to Faisal's own assassination.
It is a perfect, horrible Shakespearean tragedy. The very modernization he championed created the backlash that killed him.
The aftermath must have been huge, both domestically and internationally.
It was. The funeral was massive. Sadat was there, Yasser Arafat, Idi Amin, leaders from all over the world flew in. The assassin, Prince Faisal bin Musaid, was publicly beheaded in Riyadh a few months later.
And the country itself, it didn't collapse into a succession crisis.
No, the system Faisal built held up. The succession was smooth. King Khalid, Faisal's half-brother, took the throne. But the spirit of the country changed.
How so?
Well, this brings us to the legacy. Faisal left behind a modernized state, a wealthy state, and institutions like the King Faisal Foundation, which does a lot of philanthropic work. Cities were named after him. Lalpur in Pakistan was renamed Faisalabad.
But there's a sense of what if, isn't there? A massive one.
There is a massive what if. Faisal was this unique figure who could balance the religious conservatives and the modernizers. He had the credibility to look the ulema in the eye and say, no, this is good for Islam. We are doing this.
And look at what happened just a few years after his death, 1979.
1979 is the year everything changed again. You had the Iranian Revolution, which put a Shia theocracy on their border, and then you had the siege of Mecca, where religious extremists took over the Grand Mosque.
And the Saudi response to that siege was to turn sharply conservative.
Exactly. To appease the religious base and prevent another uprising, the government rolled back many social freedoms. Cinemas were closed, women's public roles were severely restricted, a lot of the modernizing spirit was put on ice.
So the provocative question to leave our listeners with is this. If Faisal hadn't been assassinated, if he had been the one on the throne to guide Saudi Arabia through the storm of 1979,
Would he have handled it differently? His grandson mentioned that after the 1967 war, Faisal became very quiet and contemplative, as if he felt the enormous weight of the era to come. Perhaps he foresaw how difficult the path ahead was. But if he had lived, it is very possible that the extreme conservatism that defined Saudi Arabia from 1980 until very recently, well, it might never have happened.
he might have been able to keep that balance.
He might have, and the Middle East today could look very, very different.
A king who stopped the world with oil and perhaps could have stopped a tide of extremism just with his presence. It's a fascinating and ultimately tragic deep dive.
Indeed.
That's it for this week. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.